Hello and welcome to the Broken Sword. Today we are taking a look at the lives of the Dwarves of Thorin's company.
Build me an army worthy of Mordor.
Bifur, Bofur, Bombur. Dori, Nori, Ori, Fili, Kili, Oin, Gloin, Balin, Dwalin and Thorin. These are the 13 dwarves who made up Thorin's company, along with the Hobbit Bilbo Baggins and the wizard Gandalf the Grey, and all of these set out from Bag End in the year 2941 of the Third Age on their mission to reclaim the Dwarven kingdom of Erebor in the Lonely Mountain. What were they doing before the mission? What happened to those who survived afterwards? Well, today I will be going through and looking at the lives of each and every of these 13 that was so important in the very first book that Tolkien ever published. But I will point out here, there is not a great deal said about all of them, but I will put together everything I can find. Let us start off with the first dwarf that I named, Bifur. Bifur is the first of our dwarves that we do not know a great deal about. We have no record of his parents, but we do know that he was born sometime between 2763 and 2809 of the Third Age, meaning he was somewhere between 132 and 178 years old when going on the Quest of Erebor. Despite not knowing his parents, we do also know that his cousins were the two brothers of Bofur and Bombur. He came from the dwarven families that had once lived in Moria, even though he himself was not one of Durin's line. Nothing is known of his life before the quest, but he would arrive to Bag End wearing his yellow hood, clarinet in hand, and set off with the others on their journey. He was not the most influential dwarf in the company, but he survived until the days after the mission, surviving the Battle of Five Armies, and after receiving his cut of the treasure, he stayed in Erebor as his home. And really, that is pretty much all we know of this first dwarf, as all we ever hear again afterwards is that he still lived in Erebor at the time of the Council of Elrond, as said by Gloin in the Fellowship of the Ring. This becomes a bit of a theme with a few of these dwarves, but it's still worth covering. The year of his death was never set. Next we move on to one of Bifur's cousins, Bofur. Again, we do not know his parents, but we do know his brother is Bombur and his cousin is Bifur. His ancestry is, of course, the same as Bofur, not being of Durin's line, but being of the other dwarves that had lived in Moria. Bofur's birth year is exactly the same as Bifur again, meaning he was born at some point between 2763 and 2809 of the Third Age. Again, meaning he could be somewhere between 132 and 178 years old at the time of the Quest of Erebor. He was the same as Bifur as well in that he turned up to Bag End in his yellow hood, also with a clarinet in hand, and he too would survive the entire quest just like his cousin, including the Battle of Five Armies, as well as spending the rest of his life in Erebor. And, yet again, also we do not know the year of his passing, all that we know is that it would have been sometime before the year 91 of the Fourth Age, as that was when the last of Thorin's company would pass, and that is a dwarf that we will get onto in a little bit. That means that it is actually possible Bofur could have fought in the Battle of Dale and the wars in the north against Sauron's forces, really the same as Bifur, but again, nothing is ever confirmed on that front. Meaning now it only makes sense after leaving Bofur to go on to Bombur. As before, Bombur's and Bofur's parents are unknown, the same as their birth year. Meaning, just like Bifur and Bofur, he was born at some point in that gap between 2809 and 2763 of the Third Age. And the reason I keep saying this is because these dwarves were known not to either be the oldest or the youngest of the 13. So this is where this rough gap of years comes from. Bombur had a defining feature that made him stand out from the other dwarves of the company, and that was his size. But no, he was not the tallest, not the shortest. He was the fattest. Bombur would not wear a yellow hood to Bag End like the other two, but instead a green one, and instead of a clarinet, he would be playing the drums. Bombur too though would survive the Quest of Erebor, even though he had a lot more trouble than the others when it came to passing through Mirkwood, for that was the point when he fell into the Enchanted River, and that meant that he fell asleep for 6 days, and the others all had to carry him. So, despite being by far the fattest, the others had to take him as a weight. But apart from that, dreaming of food and feeling as though his legs would not carry him, the rest of the way went fairly smoothly for Bombur. However, when it came time for Thorin to call a siege after taking Erebor back, it was really only Bombur along with Fili and Kili that appeared to disagree with Thorin, even if he wasn't actually brave enough to say anything to Thorin's face. But Bombur would go on to survive the Battle of Five Armies too, with him taking up a home in Erebor with Bifur and Bofur, also still being alive by the time of the Council of Elrond, albeit by that point he had become so large that he was unable to move without the aid of 6 young dwarves, meaning even if he was still alive, it is almost impossible to think that he could have even slightly fought in the Battle of Dale. But his end year of passing, again like the other two, has never been confirmed. Moving on now, we go to Dori. You may be noticing the theme here of the parentage and year of birth of this dwarf is also unknown. Dori was the brother of Nori and cousin of Ori. He was also a distant relation of Thorin, which in turn means that he was a member of the House of Durin. It was said by Thorin that Dori was actually the strongest of all the dwarves in the company, and generally a good guy despite the fact he did enjoy a good grumble too. When Dori turned up at Bag End, he arrived wearing a purple hood carrying a flute. Dori was one of the dwarves that came to Bilbo's aid several times during their mission, carrying him within the tunnels of the Misty Mountains, even though he did end up dropping him, which led to the whole instance with Gollum. He also helped Bilbo climb into a tree to escape the warg attack, and Bilbo would then use Dori's legs to cling onto as the eagles flew them away. So really, without Dori, Bilbo would not have ever made it home. And as for the Battle of Five Armies, that came and went, and Dori would survive and go on to live a wealthy life in the Lonely Mountain. Gloin would also mention on him still being alive at the time of the Council of Elrond, meaning he too would have likely fought in the Battle of Dale, but his death date is also unknown. Now we go on to Dori's brother, Nori. Nori's birth and parent details are another unknown, with him too also falling in that same potential age gap as the others. Nori would turn up to Bag End with his purple hood and flute just like his brother, and was a lover of food, also like his brother, and Bilbo too. He was one of the dwarves who did not stand out too much within the company, but he too would survive until at least the time of the War of the Ring, having lived in Erebor as well. Yet again, it is assumed that he would have then gone on to fight in the Battle of Dale, but yet again, his death timing is unknown, and I do have to apologise for the repeated facts on some of these dwarves. But anyway, let's move on, as next is Dori and Nori's cousin, Ori. Being a relation, his origins are the same as the previous two, a member of the House of Durin, but nothing else known, except him too being born somewhere between the years 2763 and 2809 of the Third Age. Upon his arrival to Bag End, he would be wearing a grey hood, and would play the flute like his cousins too. Yet again, he would survive the Battle of the Five Armies, and make a wealthy life for himself in Erebor after. However, this is where things stop being the same, for Ori would follow Balin and others in an attempt to reclaim the ancient dwarven realm of Khazad in the year 2989 of the Third Age. Although initially they achieved some success, Balin would be killed within the first 5 years, and other dwarves would be wiped out as well. Ori would end up being in the Chamber of Mzabal, the location of Balin's tomb that we see in the Fellowship of the Ring, and he would write the last pages of the Book of Mzabal that Gandalf would come across during the Fellowship's time there. Ori wrote how he accepted there was no way out, but he wished to make a record of their time in the hope that someone in the future would find his book. This end fate would be unknown to the likes of Gloin, for that was why Gloin was even at Rivendell to seek advice on the unknown fate of their kin. And so, with Ori's sad fate, it makes sense to carry on to the other dwarf to go to Moria with Balin and Ori, and that was Oin. Oin would also be a member of the House of Durin, and is the older brother of Gloin from the company of Thorin. Oin is the first here today who we have a birth and death year of, as these are listed in a family tree section within Appendix A section of the Lord of the Rings of Durin's folk. We see he was born in the year 2774 of the Third Age, meaning he was 167 at the time of the Quest of Erebor. He turned up to Bag End wearing a brown hood and went on to survive the Battle of Five Armies, live in Erebor, then head off with Balin, Ori and the rest of the dwarf colony to attempt to reclaim Moria in 2989. This group would gain entrance and control of the East Gate and First Hall, and then the Second Hall too after a great battle. However, from there Oin would take a group of dwarves to find the West Gate exit, and this is where he would meet his end. When arriving there, he found the water to have risen a great amount, and they were attacked by the Watcher in the water. Of that party, only a couple would make it back to the others, but Oin was not amongst them. So, at 220 years old, Oin fell within the great realm of Khazad. After Oin, let's have a look at his brother, Gloin. Gloin was a great dwarf of Durin's folk, and of course was the father of Gimli, who would join the Fellowship of the Ring. However, Gloin himself would be born in 2783 of the Third Age to his father Groin of the Longbeards. This family line meant that Gloin was the great-grandson of Borin, who was the youngest son of King Nain II, and what this means is that he could claim to be a direct descendant of none other than Durin the Deathless himself. As well as being brother to Oin, Gloin was also cousin to both Balin and Dwalin, and distant relation to Thorin. But anyway, Gloin was born during the time that Durin's line were in exile, meaning he was most likely born in Dunland, and he would in fact be there during the Battle of Azanor-Bizarre in 2799, despite only being 16 at the time, and this was very unusual as he would have been considered extremely young for a dwarf at that point. However, he would manage to survive this battle and then go on to live for a time in the Blue Mountains, as despite winning the battle, Khazad was uninhabitable at this point, and so he went with the followers of Thorin as their exile continued. Despite the dwarves under Thorin living decent lives in the Blue Mountains, they continued to pine for the Lonely Mountain, and so Gloin would join the company of Thorin. Also here, Gimli was 62 years old at this point, having been born in 2879, so was considered too young to join this quest, which emphasises how unusual it really was for Gloin to have gone into the Battle of Azanor-Bizarre at only 16. But anyway, Gloin was sceptical how a hobbit could be any use to their quest, but still turned up at Bag End wearing his white hood, but he carried no instrument. Gloin was a useful member of their company, being skilled in making fires and a strong warrior too. So he too would survive the Battle of Five Armies and would settle in the Lonely Mountain with his wealth from the treasure. 77 years after the battle, Gloin would be sent by King Day Ninefoot to go to Rivendell, along with his son Gimli, to seek advice about the company of dwarves led by Balin that attempted to reclaim Moria, as all word from them had ceased. Gloin would meet and talk with Frodo Baggins here, after Frodo had recovered from the wounds that he had suffered at the hands of the Witch King, filling Frodo in on the news of his lands since he had gone on the adventure with Bilbo. Gloin would speak of the shadow passing over his people at the Council of Elrond, including the Dark Messenger that came from Mordor to ask for information on hobbits. Gloin himself, though, would not join the Fellowship, but his son Gimli would. It is not confirmed if Gloin himself fought in the Wars of the North and the Battle of Dale, but it can be fairly safely assumed that he would have, and then he went on to live on until the year 15 of the Fourth Age. Having now covered Gloin, let's move sideways to the first of his cousins, Balin. Balin was born in the year 2763 of the Third Age to his father Fundin. He was the older brother of Dwalin, also a member of Thorin's company, and therefore they were both members of Durin's folk. Balin was only 7 years old when Smaug drove the dwarves out of the Lonely Mountain to begin their exile, so he would go on to live in Dunland under King Thror, grandfather of Thorin, for a time after this. Balin too would be at the Battle of Azanor-Bizarre, but as he was only 36 at the time, again still young for a dwarf, it is unknown exactly what role he played, similar to Gloin. After this battle, Balin would also go to live in the Blue Mountains. Years later, in 2841, Balin and Dwalin would go on an expedition to see Erebor again, but this time it was with Thrain. However, Sauron had a close eye on them as he had wished to regain the Ring of Thror from Thrain. He sent several evil things to harass them, such as wolves, orcs, evil birds, and eventually an evil rain. And this rain is what separated the group and forced them into the borders of Mirkwood. It was at this point that Thrain was not seen again by the dwarves, as he had been captured, taken to Dol Guldur, and tortured for the ring. Balin and Dwalin would manage to return to the Blue Mountains though and pass on what had happened and declare that Thorin was now the king of Durin's folk. Time would pass on and Gandalf would persuade Thorin to take Bilbo Baggins on their quest, with the accidental help of a misunderstanding Balin. Balin believed that this hobbit was an outright thief, to which Gandalf replied that they would fail without him, and that is what in turn caused Thorin to agree to meet Bilbo. So, although unintentionally, it was kind of down to Balin. And so Balin would arrive wearing his scarlet hood, carrying his viol. Balin would often serve as the chief lookout for the company, beginning with watching out for the arrival of Bilbo outside of the Green Dragon Inn that next morning. When it came to any tasks, Balin would usually work closely with his brother Dwalin, and the two worked great as a team. By the time the company reached Erebor, Balin had come from mistrusting the Hobbit burglar to Bilbo's closest friend of any of the dwarves. Balin would go on to survive the Battle of Five Armies and live for a time under the mountain. He would even travel with Gandalf in the year 2949 to visit Bilbo back in the Shire, bringing updates and stories of their rebuilt kingdom. Balin had stayed wealthy after Thorin's company split their treasure, but that did not put out the flame of desire to one day return to Moria. He was counselled against it by Dane, but nonetheless, Balin set off to attempt to reclaim the ancient realm of Khazad Dûm, as well as secretly hoping to be able to rediscover the lost ring of Thror II, as it had been assumed he lost it when entering the gates all of those years before and getting killed by Azog. Of Thorin's company, Balin, Oin and Ori went, along with several other dwarves, and they achieved initial success entering the Great Gates, reaching the 21st Hall and setting up a throne room in the Chamber of Mizarbor, whereby Balin became the Lord of Moria. So for the first 5 years, everything appeared to be going according to plan. During those 5 years, they found and reclaimed many great treasures, including the likes of the legendary weapon Durin's Axe. However, one day in November in 2994, Balin wandered to go look into Mirrormere, but he was not alone, for an orc archer snuck up and let loose an arrow and fatally wounded the dwarf. Balin's body would be taken and placed in the tomb within the Chamber of Mizarbor, but the orc that shot him was just the first of many that would then trap the others within Moria, and as we know, in time they were all wiped out. This end fate of Balin and his fellow dwarves would only be discovered when the Fellowship passed through the mines themselves, stumbling across Ori's writings. After that sad, tragic end for Balin, let's have a look at his brother next, Dwalin. Dwalin was born in the year 2772 of the Third Age, making him 9 years younger than his brother. Being Balin's brother, we already know about his father and that he was part of the line of Durin's folk. Smaug's attack had come 2 years before his birth, so he had never seen Erebor in his early life. Dwalin was only in his early 20s during the War of the Dwarves and Orcs, so nothing is known of him really at this time. But at some point, he and Balin would join up with the dwarves who had gone to the Blue Mountains, which, as I said before, is assumed to have been straight away, but either way, they ended up there in the end. Also, as mentioned with Balin, Dwalin went on the expedition which led to the disappearance of King Thrain and Thorin becoming their new king. So the time would go on and Dwalin would be the first dwarf to appear at Bag End with his dark green hood and viol that he leaves on the doorstep. He would be present throughout the quest, survive the Battle of Five Armies, and choose to stay in Erebor afterwards. Dwalin remained in Erebor while Balin went on his expedition to Moria, and remained here until the year 91 of the Fourth Age. Dwalin is thought to have fought and survived in the Battle of Dale, as he would later pass on in Erebor as the last of any of the dwarves of Thorin's company to die at the age of 340. We are now down to our final three, where firstly we will look at Fili. Fili was born in the year 2859 of the Third Age, whose mother, Dis, was the sister of Thorin. Fili was with Kili and Thorin when Gandalf persuaded them to take up the mission to remove Smaug, and so, wearing his blue hood, he arrived at Bag End in 2859 carrying his small fiddle. Fili and his brother were easily the youngest of the company, being nearly 50 years younger than the next closest, with Kili being 5 years younger than him. He was ever active and helpful throughout the quest. However, when it came to the Battle of Five Armies, Fili's luck ran out. He was slain during the battle while fighting side by side with his brother, defending the mortally wounded body of their uncle Thorin. It was this great sacrifice that meant that their mother, Dís, was the only dwarf woman to get any mention in the lines of their descendants. And so it now makes perfect sense to move quickly on to his brother, Kili. As I said, Kili was 5 years younger than his brother, being born in 2864, and therefore was the very youngest member of Thorin's company. He and his brother, although not twins, were basically inseparable during their lives. So just like Fili, Kili lived his early life in the Blue Mountains where Thorin lived after Thrain II had disappeared, and then followed Thorin to join him on the quest to remove Smaug from the Lonely Mountain. Kili would turn up to Bag End just like his brother with blue hood and small fiddle in hand, and be a useful member to the company throughout their journeys. Kili would suffer the same fate as his brother, being slain at the Battle of Five Armies after standing side by side with his brother, fighting until the end to defend their mortally wounded uncle and king. After both the deaths of Fili, Kili and Thorin, the line of Thror was sadly ended, bringing an end to that entire dynasty. So now, with 12 dwarves covered, only one remains: Thorin. Thorin was born in 2746 of the Third Age, being the son of Thrain II and grandson of Thror. It is assumed his early life was in the Lonely Mountain, as this is when his grandfather Thror was king under the mountain. Thorin was only 24 when Smaug descended upon the mountain, forcing everyone to flee. Luckily for Thorin, he was not actually inside of the mountain when the flames rained down. All those who did survive then were driven into exile, either going to the Iron Hills or like Thorin ending up in Dunland. Thorin's grandfather Thror would be murdered by Azog in the year 2790, 20 years after the sack of Erebor, after trying to re-enter Khazad, which is then what led to the War of the Dwarves and Orcs taking place, which then culminated with the Battle of Azan-ul-Bizar in 2799. Here, Thorin and his father would be wounded but survive. However, Thorin's brother Frerin would be killed. It was in fact during this battle, after his shield was broken and he picked up an oak branch to block attacks, that Thorin would gain the name Thorin Oakenshield. Thorin declared he would only use this shield of oak until one day he should be hailed as king under the mountain. Due to the presence of Durin's Bane in Moria, the dwarves were forced back into their exile. However, this time they ended up settling in the Blue Mountains, and despite becoming fairly comfortable here, they still longed to return to the Lonely Mountain. It was around this time that Thrain, along with Balin and Dwalin, set off on their expedition that Thrain would never return from in 2850, and so Thorin now became King of Durin's folk, but not yet King under the mountain. More years would pass, or 91 years to be precise, until Thorin would completely, by fluke, meet the wizard Gandalf the Grey. They shared the desire for Smaug to be dealt with, and so, that year, the idea of the Quest of Erebor was fully born and put into action. Thorin would then arrive at Bag End with his sky blue hood on his head, and the next day they would all set off on their quest. During the early part of their adventure, after the group had been captured by and then saved from trolls, Thorin came across an elvish blade, Orcrist, which he then claimed for his own. This would be the same troll horde that Gandalf acquired Glamdring from and Bilbo Sting from. They would travel onwards and eventually reach the Lonely Mountain, where, with the last light of Durin's Day, revealed the secret side door to the mountain and used the key to enter it. Bilbo was sent in by Thorin, and Smaug awoke, angry, and went on to attack the Lake Men, where he would then be shot down by Bard the Bowman. Thorin took this opportunity to enter the mountain and fortify the main entrance. Thorin would not share any claim of his treasure, even though a host of wood elves and lake men approached the mountain, and so Erebor was now under siege. Thorin sent for help from his cousin in the Iron Hills, Dane Ironfoot, and he would soon appear with more than 500 dwarves behind him. Bilbo would also greatly anger Thorin here, for he had taken the Arkenstone and given it to Bard of the Lakemen and Thranduil of the Wood Elves to bargain with, and this led to Bilbo being cast out from the company. It appeared as though a great battle between dwarves, elves and men was about to begin. However, suddenly an army led by Bolg, the son of Azog, appeared and attacked. And so the Battle of Five Armies began with the forces of men, elves, dwarves, goblins and wargs fighting to the death. It took a little time, but Thorin came to his senses and left his fortified walls, leapt from the front gate and rallied all dwarves, men and elves to him, turning the tide of the battle in their favour. However, Thorin became mortally wounded as a result of his heroic actions, with his sister sons, Fili and Kili, being slain while trying to protect him. But nonetheless, the forces of good would come out on top. In the aftermath of the battle, Thorin would apologise to Bilbo for his actions and his words, using his last breaths to tell Bilbo how if there were more people like him, the world would be a merrier place. And so, Thorin Oakenshield, who for the briefest of times had finally become Thorin King Under the Mountain, passed away in 2941, and his body was laid to rest deep within the Lonely Mountain, with Bard placing the Arkenstone upon his chest and Thranduil placing Orcrist upon his tomb. And so there we have it, a look into the lives of all 13 dwarves from the company of Thorin. Because The Hobbit was just a children's book when it was written, there is not necessarily a great deal known about every single one of these dwarves, but nonetheless I really felt like it was worth going over everything we did know within this video, however briefly that may have been. And also with our bonus upload last week looking at the potential reading orders for Tolkien's works, it was just so good to go back and look at the story that started everything off in The Hobbit. And now with that finished off, it is time for my question for you all today, and that is, who is your favourite dwarf from Thorin's company? Is it the main guy, Thorin, a supporting character like Balin or Gloin, or just someone completely different that is maybe slightly unexpected? Perhaps because of the movies rather than the books? I'd love to hear all of your thoughts and opinions in the comment section below. And now that we have reached the end of the video, I would also like to remind you all, we do not just have this channel but 3 others as well, and they are the Tabletop Alliance for all things tabletop gaming, the 6th Ranger for all things Power Rangers, and History of Dragon Ball for all things Dragon Ball. Links for each of those channels will be in the description below if they may interest you. And now it is time to shout out our patrons, with firstly our Divine Power tier members of Kevin, Abram, Matt, and Glorfindel of Gondolin. You are all awesome. And a big thanks to our Fire Demon tier members of Nashith, Denversteel, and Gregory. And as well, I cannot forget the Wizard Staff tier members of John, Andrew, and Pirate747. You are all true legends of the Brohirrim. Finally, if you have not already as well, please do all the great stuff, hit the like button on the video, subscribe to the channel, you know all the things to do by now, and every single one of them is really appreciated by us. So thank you once more if you have managed to reach the very end of this video with me today, and I will see you next time on The Broken Sword.